Greetings, 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 Hotep. This is a special of Building Legacy with yours truly, Senate Dr. ChenziRa of Parent University Institute. And I'm really honored and privileged to be joined by one of our illustrious, honorable brethren. And I always refer to him as Baba, or my elder brother, Cardinal Mills. Greetings, Hotep, my brother.
Hotep, greetings. It's good to be in touch with you once again.
Likewise.
You know, we've had this crazy circumstance with all the rest of the insanity we've had to deal with over the years. We just had one added dimension that kept us apart a little bit more than we normally would like. And I say a little bit more. You know, we heard the term social distancing coming up a lot during that period. And I kind of wondered at it because we were already socially distanced. So this kind of serious to me, a little bit more serious. I mean, how much further can we get than we were already? Anyway.
That's an excellent way to segue into part of our reasoning. The intention of having this as a relatively concise, just some brevity in our discourse around the restoration of our humanity, how that is linked to reparatory justice, how that is linked to various movements and initiatives that African people and the rest of the world are prioritizing as we come out of this space of the restorative justice piece, the reparative justice piece, and how we're bringing some of this truth to power in our work. You mentioned some strategies, some techniques that we should try to use in order to bring our communities, not just our individual selves, our families, our village, etc., but how do we authentically strengthen our communities, again, person to person. And you also highlighted how we would approach leaders, whether it's in the executive branches of governance, legislative branches of governance, judicial branches of governance, and the civilian that are impacted by all this governance. And I just desired for you to give that snippet of where we could start. How do we shift the mindset? So, because you said it really eloquently earlier today in a very interesting space where we weren't recording.
Yeah, we've got to come to the recognition and acknowledgement that we actually need to restore ourselves to the shape and essence of our humanity. We've got to realize right now, the space that we are confined to, and that is globally, that we are confined to a socio-cultural system that has been developed to facilitate human degradation. And all of us have been socialized to conform to its prescriptions. And that means that in the fulfillment of our social obligations, we are forced to abandon our human obligation. And in order for that restoration to occur socially on a global scale, the architects, engineers, administrators of the social construct have to come to the realization and the recognition of their need to heal and cleanse from the impact of the socialization process. Because the truth is, none of us has escaped that impact. Because from the moment of conception, we have begun to feel or experience the toxins of social operation. And therefore, we end up on the other side of our birth, or being seriously damaged, injured, infected, corrupted, whichever of those terms that you want to use, on a mental and psychological level, which alters us from the shape and essence of our humanity. That needs to be restored. And it's not just among the people that we call social deviants. It is essential, and even more essential, among the people who are in positions of leadership, decision-making, and, despite of the illustrious titles that we may have conferred upon them.
Correct.
But that does not seem to be happening, because we are deeply entrenched in the belief that human degradation is a legitimate process. Give me 5 minutes.
See, because part of what I'm very grateful for us being able to bring to the table is the fact that there is an overarching concern on where do we start to find the solutions for all of these imbalanced, unstable, antagonistic exchanges that keep permeating around. And I'm focusing on African people, and I'd like to be real clear, African, Black, melanated, West Indian, Caribbean, indigenous, ancestral inhabitants of these spaces. How do we move beyond the ideological discussions of Pan-Africanism and make it practical, moving beyond universal African fundamentalism, coming out of the Garvey movements of the 20th century and moving forward, and addressing these very corrupt forms of what some scholars, I'll focus on what Dr. Carlisle Corbin has referred to as colonialocracy. Some Pan-Africanists refer to the democratic process as demonocracy. At the end of the day, these pieces of self-determination, liberation, unification, its principles, and just Pan-African ideals for melanated, ancestral, sovereign people becomes an issue. And like we have discussed previous to this particular session, what are the ways? I know what came from me was people's tribunals. And you highlighted that there's a process even before we convene a people's tribunal to improve the mindsets of the people that are going to be in these tribunals, which is very valid. And my question to you was, what are some of the steps that would be recommended to do that? And how do we create spaces again, yes, we're speaking from a Virgin Island, St. Croix Virgin Island space. How do we introduce that again to leaders that are in the positions where they could really affect change, when the institutions that they're inside of, the forms of governance, are counter-revolutionary and actually counter-human? They're not facilitating human development and growth and upliftment and positivity. That was my
That's that's exactly the 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 emphasis. The emphasis has to be on our humanity. The emphasis has to be on what we understand as the quality of spiritual and psychological character that identifies us as being in the essence of the Creator. We have lost that because the term human is not a biological classification, it's a spiritual identity. And we have to, if we understand our history and culture as African people, those concepts are within the foundation of that cultural development. The two most important aspects of my identity are my spiritual identity, which is human, and my ancestral and cultural identity, which is African. Now, we have been dealing with certain concepts that have been adulterated. And one of those concepts is the concept of humanhood.
Mm.
Some people been forced to think of it as a biological classification when it's actually is a term of spiritual identity. The spirit of humanity which we embody is going to reflect our activities and behavior patterns. And whether we are incarnated of that spirit will be reflected in our activities or behavior patterns, in the way we relate and interact with each other.
Right.
As far as I'm concerned, the formulas and standards and mechanisms by which we relate to each other in this environment are inimical to the concept of humanity.
Okay. And what would be, right, continue, please. I'm looking for those stratagems that were implied in previous discourse. And I'm also interested in how we can begin to share some of this in a framework that we can practice. And we can, for example, if, here it's an election year, some persons aren't engaged in the process, and that's one way of making your voice heard. And some people are really engaged in the process and are not challenging or demanding that the election process authentically be inclusive. It's one thing, we remember taxation without representation is tyranny, right? And we know tyranny. We know a lot of that. And we know the lack of representation, or more correctly, the lack of adequate, efficient, effective representation. And what you began to articulate with specific pieces in previous discussions were the strategies, the methods, and just the practical, what do we need to do to get at least to having that conversation. I rushed into the perspective of a people's tribunal, primarily because the focus was on getting persons within the community to begin to engage on these types of discourse.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right. You were absolutely right when you said there's a mindset shift that must serve as a precursor for doing that, or else we're just going to be spinning our wheels and having either the same people that already are ready for change in the room and those that we really need to have engaged that aren't as aware or involved in that kind of transformative change. They won't be present. And that seems to be what keeps happening as we keep having leaders that present all this wonderful vision and all these exceptional perspectives and ideas and activities and wonderful platforms. However, the institution that they're going into, these actual structures, are not designed for the greatest and highest good of humanity. Now,
That is because they were not designed for that purpose.
boom.
And they were not designed for that purpose because the spirit, the psyche that dictates their existence is antithetical to the spirit of humanity. That transformation has to take place. And our whole life experience, you know, even if you just take a slice of it, let's say we take the last 600 years, our life's experience has been shrouded in an environment, a really toxic environment, that undermines the attributes of our humanity. So we have become incapable of building, developing, cultivating the type of institutional structures that are necessary to the preservation of our human character. So the people we have now, the people we are in positions of leadership, the people who are in powerful positions of this decision making, they also have to come to the realization of the need for cleansing and healing. You cannot, presume their perfection, their righteousness, their wholesomeness, because they hold titles, I should say they hold illustrious titles and social positions. So we've got to go through that entire transformation. The criminal justice system is made up of people who are just as defective as the people that it administers and consider to be social deviants and lock away in a prison. So the whole process has to begin with the recognition and acknowledgement of that dysfunction and corruption among all our people. Or else we are not going to get any place. We're going to be making the same promises over and over and over again. Okay, let me put this in mind. The architects of American democracy, I should say, and whom are called the founding fathers of America, decorated their image with impressive terms that were nothing more than an attempt to project a certain image. And that image masked their true character. And what I'm saying here is that the references to the primacy of humanhood and the sanctity of human rights were mere decorations. As James Baldwin says, I hear what you say, but I don't believe you.
There you go.
Because I see what you do.
Exactly. And that's
And
where we're going. Correct.
So,
Please
so
continue.
if we continue to allow them to be the example of our moral direction, how far are we going to go? We can't get back to humanity doing that. And they continue to be the example of our moral direction when they're completely lacking in moral integrity. And so many people are afraid to say that because somebody's going to say, how dare you consider our illustrious fathers as immoral? The foundation of any society are human beings. So if you lay the foundations of your society by denigrating and dehumanizing human beings, that's the only thing that your society is going to be able to do. So all of our major mechanisms, so all of our major social mechanisms are shrouded, I should say, are centered around the principle of human degradation. Democracy is synchronized with elitism, racism, slavery, capitalism, white supremacy, and all of these have their roots in human degradation. So how could a democracy that is synchronized with these mechanisms of oppression guarantee human liberty? But we believe that we are entrenched in this belief that democracy synchronized with mechanisms of oppression, I listed them for you, sexism and all that, class stratification. How could that arrangement that is built around the principle of human degradation materialize in a social construct that guarantees the protection of the entitlements of humanhood? It cannot happen. It is impossible.
And that's where we are going to expand part of our next discourse and conversation when we open out with some critical data. And when I say that, so that persons can have something to pull and look at and review, because some of the things that you're saying take persons outside of the realm of just following the status quo.
Right.
And accepting these processes, these so-called principles and procedures as the way in which we're supposed to conduct ourselves and the way that the world should work. And one of the things, there's many things that I'm grateful for. And one of the things that sticks out around this limitation, through this global pandemic piece that affected all layers of our public health protocols, is that it gave us time to reset and to reevaluate how we are to engage as humans. It was intentional to limit persons' connectivity, connection, relationships with one another. It was intentional, remains intentional, to create limitations on how persons protest, raise
Right.
inquiry around injustices, how persons address reparatory justice and just reparations and anything around repairing the relationships that we have as people of African melanated ancestral ancestry to the way that the world works in this so-called New World Order. It's not really a New World Order, maybe New World Order to them. It's not a New World Order to us, because there was always this lack of inclusivity for us, by us, with us. And that's something that is starting to come to the hilt, because the capitalist model is disintegrating. It's really disintegrated. However, persons have put up false, let's say, like facades to make it look like
Right.
it still exists and it's still flourishing and it's still functional. However, at the end of the day, and when we look and see, what's happening in our schools, in our spaces of higher education, so-called, which are overwhelmed with miseducation and mismanagement and just
Mhm.
dismiss stuff, what's happening with our media, and the way that the media, everyone is a journalist, they believe, and everyone's open to subjectivity and reporting and tri-sidedness. I don't even call it one-sided, because it's this side, that side, tri-side kind of behavior. And it would be great to know, like you had said in the very beginning, and as you've shared, before we had this gathering, what are the ways that we can begin to even have a discussion to initiate the restoration of our humanity. And amongst, it's difficult to, I use this as an example, it's difficult to fly a plane while you're constructing the plane. And a
Exactly.
lot of times we find ourselves constructing and building in the midst of an incompleteness that demands completion for us to even get engaged. So it makes it challenging for us to do the restorative work, because we're in it, and there's a lot of broken elements.
Right.
You know, if you would be so kind to just share we're not going to call it a conclusion, and we're not going to say we're saying bye, but how we can pin this particular part of this discourse, and then we're going to, revisit this at another time and let our viewers and listeners know that we're going to keep this particular discourse with steps of action in the forefront, please.
The thing is that most people do not want to have a conversation about our dysfunction and contamination, because as we have been socialized to promote this idea and carry this notion of our wholesomeness, purity, perfection, and so in certain cases, infallibility. Challenging those notions can prove detrimental to those who present the challenge. People are not willing to engage in these conversations because, like I say, these conversations would force people to challenge their deeply held beliefs, and relinquishing those beliefs can be extremely painful.
Mm. And
Now,
that's powerful. That's powerful.
how do you get someone who has been programmed in that disposition, into that disposition, how do you get them to abandon the idea that heaven is not up in the sky someplace?
That's a good point.
You know, and most of our people are Christians, and that's a deep-seated belief within that religious institution. You know, so how do you get people who have been programmed within that institution to accept the idea that heaven is your state of the state of maturity of your consciousness, that Christ is a reference to the redemption of your human consciousness and intelligence? As we out of our experience, our human consciousness and intelligence has become buried beneath the rubble of human devastation.
Mhm.
We've got to retrieve it or redeem it in order to allow it to develop and express itself and mature. That is not happening, and it cannot happen in this environment. So we got to come to terms with the fact that our socialization did not allow us to develop in the context of our humanity, in the context of our humanhood. But how do we get our people to understand and accept that? Because how do we get our people to understand that the socialization process injured you, infected you, contaminated you? It didn't do you a favor.
Mhm.
You know, because then the guy who has his degree from Harvard and Oxford and Cambridge and Yale and Princeton and so on,
Oh,
he's going to come after you with a vengeance. Hmm?
no,
He's
you're
gonna
absolutely correct. You're absolutely correct.
gonna come
Even if
after
it's
you
not
with a
right,
vengeance.
and even
How
if it's
dare
not
you say that
right,
I'm underdeveloped and miseducated, and I have a diploma or degree with Harvard's name on it?
that is exactly why I asked the question that I asked in the very beginning. And I would love to know if it's to have more discussions that you sense this could assist us. Is it to host a series of convenings and in the interim navigate, the names of the individuals, the organizations, the initiatives, the movements that are willing to make this campaign of the restoration of our humanity a priority? Because in the meantime, for example, the United Nations designation way back in 2012, 2013 for International Day for people of International Year for people of African descent that expanded in 2015 into an international decade for people of African descent, promoting recognition, justice, and development. During this decade, some of the worst, most horrific actions against people of African descent have actually been implemented. And it speaks volumes to exactly what the United Nations is really designed or set up to do or not do, as well as the lack of inclusivity of African movements, African leaders, not only the elite Bush crew, as you stated so eloquently, not just the Harvard or Brown or even state school, even these other elite institutions that are producing powerful African minds, yes. However, the humanity portion, the restorative peace around reparatory justice, self-determination, authentic independence, principled unification are lacking. And we're seeing it, whether it's through that lens, it's powerful to see the exoneration movement for the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey moving forward. It's bigger than getting the approval from the institution of America and its head of state or head of the nation. It is for African people to exonerate Marcus Garvey first. It's for African people and the world to exonerate any of our leaders that have been ostracized, marginalized, executed, lynched, assassinated, raped, tortured, terrorized, all of that and more. It's our charge, having their legal exoneration, and I'm very clear, not a pardon, but an authentic exoneration, because in the case of Garvey, he should have never been convicted of anything.
Right.
And there are others, and because persons have brought up other similar cases for persons that are not as popular or were not as well covered in global history and affairs. So not to say that there aren't others that this would set a precedent for. However, this is something we have to do. And
that is something we have to do. Yes.
Right. So I'm looking forward to that.
I think when we take the position that we have to wait for the approval, acceptance, and pardon of the oppressor, we are surrendering our humanhood. The birth of humans, the birth of civilization, the birthplace of civilization is in Africa, in the Nile Valley. To give you one example, the concept of justice, according to our cultural framework, justice is a principle of morality. And morality is conceived as a deity of 7 principles: truth, justice, harmony, balance, reciprocity, order, and compassion. These principles operate as a synchromesh. If you dismantle one, the whole mechanism or system goes awry. So we cannot entertain justice without truth. We cannot entertain justice and truth without harmony. We cannot entertain justice, truth, and harmony with some sort of balance and communion. So we've got to introduce a different definition of these concepts. Now, in Western society and culture, justice is a consequence of legal operation, whether or not that consequence offers any kind of healing to the injured party. Okay?
Yes.
So a society, in seeking to find remedies for the evils that it creates, destroys the person, the human being it has corrupted in its pursuit of justice. Justice doesn't destroy, it heals. So you created this person, you shaped him into a certain way, you call him a criminal, and then you destroy him a second time.
Right.
And that is called justice. Where is the healing? So we've got to begin to entertain some new definitions of certain concepts. They use the same terms as we do, but these terms are not conceptualized in the same way. Their culture and history is a culture of exclusion. The idea of the people, of the formula for categorizing people into groups of greater and lesser value is fundamental to the development of that socioculture. It doesn't do anything else. The fact that I'm walking down the street, simply walking down the street, and what they see is a danger to them is a matter of their perception as dictated by their psyche. So unless there's a psychological transformation, they're going to always perceive me that way. And we have no power to effect that psychological transformation.
Noted. Noted. That's why it's important to make it clear to our viewers, listeners, this is an ongoing discussion.
It has to be an ongoing discussion.
It's an ongoing discussion because it's a discussion that's grounded in practical, more specific, pragmatic work. What are we doing in our schools? What are we doing in our places of health and wellness? What are we doing in our places of business and economic drivers that keep us centered? How are we building community? How are we engaging with basic stuff? Shelter, food, clothing, transport, clean water, currency, exchange, everything, right?
Every area of social activity
Correct.
has to be addressed. Politics, economics,
Correct.
religion,
Correct.
education, it all has to be addressed.
And that's where, just for the purposes of this evening, we're gonna put a pin and resume from this point moving forward. We're encouraging persons that have input, solutions, if you'd like to share what elements in your respective community you've been able to build legacy and meet with some degree of success. That's what we're aiming to be able to share. You know, there are a number of, you know, in our future broadcasts moving this forward, we do desire to have a list or multiple lists, I should say, you know, that are synchronizing with other organizations, individuals, families, communities that are actually building legacy that restore our shared humanity, that are actually building legacy to address the issues of security and protection and safety that are impacting specifically people of African, melanated, ancestral, indigenous ancestry. These are the types of things that we're moving in that direction of, and that's what motivated part of this discourse. I'm very grateful for what you've been able to share in a short amount of time. I know that we could do this for hours, and we're going to be doing it for some future times and bringing in other great minds and practitioners as quiet as it's kept. And because I'm usually doing this particular line of work while my beloved Nisu Nepkara Hirisheta Paheru continues to do the building on a groundbreaking physical space, as the illustrious contractor slash project manager slash designer he is. I'm looking forward to bringing him in and, as his time permits, and bringing in others, some of our African Queen Mother warriors, right? Sister Queen Isis Amlak, Sister Queen Tempu Nefertari, Sister Queen Aziza, as well as Sister Dr. Sandra Richards and others. So the intention is to bring these types of discourses with solutions and, connecting the dots to other agencies, initiatives, movements that are doing this work where we can see some semblance of the restorative elements of our humanity, one moment at a time, preferably by tomorrow, but at least we see it in this lifetime. We'll see, we need to see some growth in this lifetime. Thank you so much, brother.
You're welcome. It's always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure, always a pleasure. And until our next broadcast, live free, live safe, live well. Remember that culture heals humanity. Land is our foundation, and spiritual harmony unifies us. Hotep.
Hotep.